Before we dive into this incredible untold story, a story of choices, close calls, and the faith of one woman who saw a superstar when everyone else saw a statistic, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. Ring that notification bell, too, because you won't want to miss a single chapter of how a hip-hop legend was saved from the streets. This is a story you have to see to believe. Now, let's get into it. The Long Beach sun in the late 80s was a different kind of hot. It wasn't just the temperature. It was a heavy, thick heat that seemed to press down on the asphalt, carrying the low hum of distant sirens and the faint scent of salt from the port. For a lanky, sharp-witted teenager named Calvin Broadus, it was the only air he knew. He moved with a slow, deliberate coolness, a walking contradiction of laid-back charm and the tightly coiled alertness required by the streets of the East Side. His days were a blur of sun-drenched sidewalks and shadowed alleyways. He was drawn to the camaraderie, the feeling of belonging that came with rolling with his crew, the Rollin' Twenties Crips. There was a power in their numbers, a shared identity that felt more real than anything school had to offer. They weren't master criminals, not yet. Their activities were a mix of youthful rebellion and territorial posturing, tagging walls, loitering with intent, and projecting an image of untouchable toughness. This afternoon was no different. Calvin stood with three of his friends at the corner of Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue and 21st Street, leaning against the warm brick of a corner store. Laughter echoed as they traded stories, their voices a rhythmic part of the neighborhood's soundtrack, but their eyes were always moving, scanning every car that slowed, every unfamiliar face that passed. It was a language of survival, a constant low-level hum of anxiety beneath the cool exterior. From the second-story window of a modest, well-kept home just down the street, Evelyn Harris watched them. She was Calvin's aunt, his mother's older sister, and her heart ached with a familiar, heavy dread. She saw past the posturing and the bravado. She saw her nephew, the quiet boy who used to sing in the church choir, his voice pure and true. She saw a flicker of genius in his eyes, a quick wit that could craft rhymes out of thin air, and it terrified her. She had seen this story play out too many times before on these same streets. She knew how quickly the laughter could turn to shouts, how fast the camaraderie could curdle into a pact of mutual destruction. These boys, they thought they were kings of their small concrete kingdom, but she saw them as dominoes, lined up, and ready to fall at the slightest push. Every siren that wailed in the distance felt like a premonition, a warning she prayed Calvin would somehow hear. The air shifted, the lazy afternoon vibe broken by the slow crawl of a cherry-red lowrider. It wasn't a car from their neighborhood. The music thumping from its speakers was a challenge, a bass-heavy declaration of intrusion. Calvin and his crew immediately straightened up, their laughter gone, replaced by a tense, unified silence. Their hands, which had been gesturing wildly moments before, now rested loosely at their sides. Ready. Car, filled with faces they recognized as rivals, paused directly in front of them. No words were exchanged, but the air crackled with unspoken threats. It was a standoff, a test of nerve measured in heartbeats. Calvin's mind raced, his cool demeanor a mask for the adrenaline surging through him. This was the precipice, the moment where a wrong look or a whispered insult could ignite a war that would consume them all. From her window, Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She gripped the windowsill, her knuckles turning white. She wasn't just watching a tense moment. She was watching her nephew's future hang in the balance, swaying precariously over a chasm of violence and despair. She felt utterly helpless, a silent observer to a tragedy she could feel unfolding, as real as the heat rising from the pavement below. Suddenly, the driver of the red car offered a curt, dismissive nod and hit the gas, tires chirping as the vehicle sped away. The immediate threat was gone, but a toxic residue of fear and anger remained. Calvin's friends started talking at once, their voices loud with bravado, masking the fear they all felt. They celebrated it as a victory, a sign of their strength and reputation. But Calvin was quiet. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving a cold, hollow feeling in its place. He hadn't felt powerful. He had felt like a target. He looked up and, for a brief moment, his eyes met Evelyn's across the street. He saw the raw fear on her face, the desperate plea in her gaze, and for the first time, he felt a crack in the hardened facade he worked so hard to maintain. He offered his crew a quick, mumbled excuse and started walking home. The weight of his aunt's gaze following him like a spotlight. The brief encounter had shaken something loose inside him. The thrill of the street, the allure of the gang, suddenly felt cheap and incredibly dangerous. He was standing at a crossroads, and he was beginning to understand that both paths led away from the boy he used to be. The walk home felt longer than usual. Every corner seemed to hold a memory of a choice made, a step taken in a direction he was no longer sure of. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows that looked like grasping hands. He knew his aunt would be waiting for him, and he knew the conversation they were about to have would be anything but easy. The front porch of his aunt's house was her sanctuary, a small, clean space with 2 rocking chairs and a pot of wilting but resilient geraniums. Evelyn was sitting in one of the chairs when Calvin approached, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She didn't look angry. She looked tired, her face etched with a sorrow that went deeper than the events of the afternoon. She just watched him walk up the steps, her silence more unnerving than any lecture could be. "Calvin," she said, her voice soft but firm, leaving no room for argument. "Come sit with your auntie for a minute." He obeyed, sinking into the other rocking chair, the creak of the wood sounding unnaturally loud in the evening quiet. He avoided her eyes, focusing instead on a crack in the concrete sidewalk. He braced himself for the scolding, for the disappointment, for the litany of his failures. But Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She began to speak about his mother, about how much she worried. She spoke of the sleepless nights, the constant fear. Every time he was late, the prayers that felt like they were being hurled into a void. "She loves you so much, baby," Evelyn said, her voice catching slightly. "We all do. And it breaks our hearts to see you throwing away the gifts God gave you." She then started to talk about his past, a past he tried to keep separate from his present. She reminded him of when he was 7, singing a solo in the church choir, his small voice filling the entire sanctuary with a pure, hopeful sound. She reminded him of how he taught himself to play the piano by ear on the old, out-of-tune upright in their grandmother's house, picking out melodies with a focus and passion he now reserved for the streets. "Where did that boy go, Calvin?" she asked, her gaze gentle but piercing, forcing him to finally look at her. The boy who loved music more than anything? The boy who could make people smile just by humming a tune? "I see him, you know. I see him under all that nonsense you carry around like armor. But I'm scared you're starting to forget him." She painted 2 vivid pictures for him, her words creating images in his mind that were impossible to ignore. In one, she described the cold, stark reality of a prison cell, the clang of a steel door, the endless, wasted years. She spoke of the alternative, the grim finality of a street corner memorial, with melted wax and faded teddy bears marking the spot where a life was cut short. Then, she painted the other picture. She described a stage, bright lights, and a crowd of people hanging on his every word. She described the energy of creation, the joy of making music that meant something, of telling his story in a way that could move thousands. "You have a voice, Calvin," she insisted, "not just for singing, but a voice to tell the world who you are. Don't let these streets take that voice from you." Calvin sat there, stripped bare by her words. It wasn't an attack. It was an appeal to the best part of himself, a part he had been systematically burying. He felt a profound sense of shame, not because he was caught, but because he knew she was right. Every word resonated with a truth he had been actively avoiding for months, maybe even years. The cool persona, the tough guy act, it all felt like a cheap costume under her honest gaze. The silence returned, but this time it was filled with the weight of her words, the sounds of the neighborhood, a distant argument, the rumble of a car stereo, kids playing down the block, faded into the background. All he could hear was the echo of her question. Where did that boy go? He had no answer for her. He had no answer for himself. He felt a tear escape his eye, a single hot drop of emotion he couldn't control. He quickly wiped it away, hoping she didn't see, but he knew she had. She didn't comment on it. She just reached over and placed her hand on his, her skin warm and steady. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like an anchor in the turbulent sea of his emotions. "It ain't too late," she whispered. as if reading his thoughts. It's never too late to choose a different path, Calvin. But you have to choose it. No one can do it for you. You have to want that future more than you want their approval. She squeezed his hand gently, a final impartment of her strength and belief. He left her porch that evening a different person than the one who had arrived. The hollow feeling was still there, but it was now filled with a chaotic mix of shame, regret, and a tiny flickering spark of hope. Her words had been a mirror, forcing him to look at his own reflection, and he didn't like the person he was becoming. The choice was his, and for the first time, he was terrified of making the wrong one. This story is getting real, isn't it? The choice between the streets and a dream. If you're feeling the weight of this moment, if you've ever had someone believe in you like this, let us know in the comments what you think Calvin should do. And if you haven't already, please hit that like button. It helps the channel more than you know, and shows that stories like this matter. Evelyn was a woman of faith, but her faith wasn't passive. She believed in prayer, but she also believed God helped those who helped themselves, and those who helped the ones they loved. She didn't wait for Calvin to have an epiphany. She knew that an idea, no matter how powerful, needed fertile ground to grow. The next day, after her shift cleaning offices downtown, she didn't go straight home. She took a bus to a part of town known for its pawn shops. She walked past windows filled with forgotten treasures and tools of abandoned trades. Guitars with missing strings, power drills, dusty televisions. She wasn't looking for a treasure. She was looking for a tool. A tool for salvation. In the back of the third shop she visited, she found it. It was a used Roland TR-808 drum machine and a small 4-track Tascam cassette recorder. They were scuffed and looked dated even for the time, but the shop owner assured her they worked. The price he quoted made her stomach clench. It was nearly all of a special fund she kept tucked away in a coffee can, money saved dollar by dollar for a new roof or a real emergency. She looked at the machines, then looked through the grimy window at the street outside. In her mind, she saw Calvin standing on that corner, saw the red car, saw the two futures she had described to him. This, she decided, was a real emergency. The next afternoon, she told Calvin to come with her. She didn't say where they were going. He was quiet and subdued, following her onto the city bus without protest. When they arrived at the pawn shop, he looked confused. She led him to the back, to the counter where the owner had the drum machine and recorder waiting. She pointed at them. "These are for you," she said simply. Calvin stared at the equipment, then back at his aunt, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. This wasn't a lecture or a plea. This was a tangible thing. This was an investment. "Auntie," he stammered, "I can't. This is too much." "How?" He knew she didn't have this kind of money. The question hung in the air, thick with unspoken understanding of her sacrifice. "Don't you worry about how," she said, cutting him off gently but firmly. She paid the man in cash, the wad of bills looking small and insignificant for the price it represented. "I told you that you have a voice. Well, a voice needs a microphone. A beat needs a drum. This is your way out, Calvin. A different kind of hustle, one that builds something instead of tearing it down." The bus ride home was silent. Calvin held the heavy drum machine on his lap, its weight feeling immense. It was more than just metal and plastic. It was the physical manifestation of her faith in him. It was a burden and a gift all at once. He felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it almost choked him, but it was mingled with a terrifying sense of pressure. What if he failed? What if he couldn't do it? Back at his house, he carried the equipment up to his small bedroom as if it were made of glass. He cleared a space on his cluttered desk, pushing aside school books and magazines. He plugged everything in, the tangle of cords a confusing mess. The room was quiet, stark contrast to the constant noise of the street that filtered through his window. It felt like a sanctuary, a laboratory, a prison cell. He sat there for a long time, just looking at the machines. The buttons and knobs were a foreign language. He had no idea where to begin. The temptation to walk out the door, back to the familiar comfort of his friends in the corner, was a physical pull. It would be so much easier. But then he thought of his aunt's face in the pawn shop, the quiet determination in her eyes. He couldn't let her down. He had to try. He pressed the power button on the TR-808. A small red light blinked to life, and the machine emitted a low electronic hum. It was a small sound, but in the silence of his room, it sounded like a promise. It was the sound of a new beginning, a sound that might just be loud enough to drown out the call of the streets. He spent hours just fiddling with the knobs, creating chaotic, clumsy rhythms that sounded nothing like the music in his head. It was frustrating, and the voice of doubt in his mind grew louder. This was a mistake. He was a poser, not a producer. He was just a kid from the East Side playing with toys he didn't understand. But he didn't stop. As night fell, he finally managed to create a simple, steady beat. Boom bap, boom boom bap. It was basic, repetitive, but it was his. He listened to it loop over and over, a small smile touching his lips for the first time all day. He leaned toward the cheap microphone he'd plugged into the Tascam recorder. He didn't have any lyrics written, but he didn't need them. He just started to speak, to rhyme, to let the rhythm carry his voice. The first few weeks were a brutal tug-of-war. During the day, the pull of his old life was relentless. His friends would come by, their voices calling to him from the street below his window. They didn't understand his sudden reclusiveness. They saw the music equipment as a strange hobby, a diversion from the real business of life as they knew it. The invitations were constant, a siren song of easy belonging. "Yo, Sea-Dog, we're making a run, you in?" one of them would yell up. The words were casual, but they carried the weight of expectation. Saying no was difficult. It felt like a betrayal, a rejection of the only brotherhood he had ever known. Each time he declined, he could feel the distance between them growing. He could hear it in their laughter as they walked away, a subtle shift from camaraderie to ridicule. "Look at him, stuck in his room with his toys," he heard one of them mutter one afternoon, the words drifting up through the open window and stinging like a slap. "Thinks he's gonna be a rap star." The mockery was hard to bear. It fed the seed of doubt that his aunt's gift had planted alongside the seed of hope. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was just a fool, hiding in his room. The struggle inside his room was just as intense. The drum machine and recorder were not magical instruments that instantly unlocked his genius. They were frustrating, complicated machines. He would spend hours trying to replicate the sounds he heard on the radio, only to produce clumsy, offbeat messes. The user manuals were dense and confusing, and there was no YouTube to guide him. He felt isolated, trapped between two worlds and belonging to neither. The street life he once craved now seemed menacing and hollow, yet the world of a musician felt impossibly distant and complex. There were days he was so overwhelmed with frustration that he would just turn everything off and lie on his bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence of the machines feeling like a judgment. It was during one of these low points that Evelyn stopped by. She didn't knock on his bedroom door. She just opened it a crack and peeked in. She saw the despair on his face, the way he was staring at the silent equipment as if it were an enemy. She didn't offer any technical advice or ask if he'd made a hit record yet. She just brought him a glass of iced tea. "Looks hard," she said, setting the glass on his desk. "I figured it would be. Nothing worth having in this life comes easy, baby. If it was easy, everybody would be doing it. The struggle is part of the story. It's what makes the victory taste so sweet." Her words were simple, but they were exactly what he needed to hear. She wasn't pressuring him for results. She was acknowledging his effort. She saw his struggle not as a sign of failure, but as a necessary part of the process. Her unwavering belief was a quiet counter-narrative to the mockery of his friends and the loud voice of his own self-doubt. She reframed his frustration as a badge of honor. After she left, he sat up and looked at the machines again. They no longer seemed like adversaries. They were a challenge, a mountain to be climbed. Her visit had been a small act, but it had replenished his resolve. He knew he couldn't give up. Giving up wasn't just about quitting on the music. It was about quitting on her faith in him, and on the new vision he had for himself. He picked up a notepad and a pen. Instead of trying to force a beat, he started to write. He wrote about the frustration, about the taunts from his friends, about the feeling of being caught in the middle. He poured all of his conflicting emotions onto the page, his words raw and honest. He wasn't just writing lyrics, he was processing his reality. The next time he switched on the TR-808, He wasn't trying to copy anyone. He was trying to create a sound that matched the feeling of his words. He twisted the knobs, experimenting, pushing the machine to its limits. He was no longer just a kid, playing with a toy. He was an artist searching for his voice, both literally and figuratively. The path was still unclear, and the outcome was far from certain. The pull of the streets hadn't vanished. His friends still called for him, and the allure of that life still flickered in the back of his mind. But now, the pull of the music was growing stronger. It was a battle fought every day, in the quiet of his room, for the salvation of his soul. The breakthrough came late one Thursday night. The house was dark and quiet, the rest of his family asleep. Outside, the neighborhood hummed with its usual nocturnal rhythm. But inside Calvin's room, a different kind of energy was building. He had been at it for hours, fueled by cheap instant noodles and a dogged determination, a refusal to be beaten by a machine. He wasn't trying to force anything anymore. He was just listening. He had started with a simple bass line, a low, funky throb that he'd stumbled upon by accident. It felt right. It was slow, menacing, and laid back all at once. It sounded like a Long Beach summer night. He let it loop, the hypnotic rhythm filling the small room. Then, he programmed a simple, sparse beat over it. A sharp snare, a crisp hi-hat. It was minimalist, but effective. Then, he picked up the notepad filled with his recent writings. He wasn't just reading lyrics. He was reading his own diary of struggle and defiance. He leaned into the microphone, the cheap foam windscreen brushing against his lips, and began to speak. The words didn't come out as an angry shout or a boastful rap. They came out in a lazy, melodic drawl, a style that was uniquely his. His voice became another instrument, weaving in and out of the beat. He rhymed about the heat, the tension, the feeling of being watched, the loyalty and betrayal of friendships. He told the story of a young man at a crossroads, not as a distant observer, but from the very heart of the conflict. The flow was conversational, almost nonchalant, but the words carried the weight of his experience. As he got deeper into the track, something clicked. The frustration that had plagued him for weeks melted away, replaced by a pure, unadulterated creative flow. The world outside his window, the sirens, the arguments, the temptations, disappeared. There was only the beat, his voice, and the story unfolding. It was the moment he stopped imitating and started originating. He worked feverishly, layering, his vocals on the 4-track recorder, punching in and out, adding ad-libs, becoming a one-man production crew. He had no formal training, only instinct. He was guided by a feeling, a deep internal sense of what sounded right. The process was messy and imperfect, but it was alive. It was authentic. It was him. By the time the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky, he was done. He slumped back in his chair, completely drained but buzzing with a new kind of adrenaline, the high of creation. He rewound the cassette tape and pressed play. As his own voice and beat filled the room, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment that nothing on the street had ever given him. He listened to the rough demo, to its hiss and its imperfections, and he didn't hear the mistakes. He heard his own potential, finally realized. He heard the voice his aunt had told him he possessed. It wasn't just a song. It was a declaration of independence. It was proof that he could build something better than the life that was waiting to claim him. He looked at the Tascam recorder, the humble machine that had captured this moment. It was no longer a source of frustration. It was his partner, his confidant, the tool that had allowed him to excavate his own soul. He finally understood what his aunt meant. The struggle had been essential. It had forged his voice in the fire of his own doubt. He ejected the cassette tape, holding the small plastic rectangle in his hand. It felt heavier than the drum machine had. It contained his story, his sound, his choice. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would never be the same. He had found his path, not by running from the streets, but by creating a world of his own, right here in his bedroom. The sun was now streaming through his window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He hadn't slept, but he felt more awake than ever before. He laid the tape on his desk, next to the picture of his mother. He was still Calvin Broadus, a kid from the East Side, but he was also something more now. He was an artist. The news traveled the way it always did on the East Side, fast and fragmented, passed in hushed tones on street corners and over backyard fences. The night before, the night Calvin had been locked in his room creating his first real song, a police raid had gone down. It was targeted at a house where his crew often gathered. The cherry-red lowrider from that tense afternoon had been there. There had been a fight, arrests, and serious charges were being laid. Calvin heard the names of his friends, the same ones who had been calling his name from the street just days ago. They were now caught in the exact future his aunt had warned him about. A future of handcuffs, court dates, and shattered possibilities. A cold, chilling wave of relief washed over him, so intense it made him feel dizzy. He wasn't there. He was safe. His choice to stay in his room wasn't just about music. It had saved him. He didn't feel triumphant or superior. He felt a deep, sorrowful gratitude. He grabbed the cassette tape from his desk, the one he had poured his soul into, and walked out the door. He didn't run, he walked with a calm purpose he hadn't felt before. He walked straight to Evelyn's house, the small tape clutched tightly in his hand. She was on her porch, of course, sweeping away leaves that weren't there. She saw him coming, and her face, already etched with worry from the neighborhood news, tightened. She expected bad news. But she saw a new light in Calvin's eyes, a steadiness that replaced the old defensiveness. He didn't say a word. He just walked up the steps and held out the tape. She looked from the cassette to his face, her expression questioning. "What's this?" she asked, her voice cautious. "It's my choice," he said simply. She led him inside, to the small living room with its plastic-covered furniture. She had an old cassette player on a side table, the kind with big, clunky buttons. He put the tape in and pressed play. The raw, hypnotic beat of the TR-808 filled the quiet room. Then came his voice, that slow, melodic, confident drawl. Evelyn sat down heavily in her armchair, her hands gripping the armrests. She listened intently, her head tilted. She heard the story in his words, the struggle, the defiance, the environment that threatened to swallow him whole. She heard more than just a song. She heard the boy from the church choir, but with the wisdom of the streets. She heard the kid who played piano by ear, but now orchestrating the sounds of his own reality. She heard the voice she had been so terrified of losing, not just preserved, but transformed into something powerful and new. It was the sound of her faith being rewarded. When the song faded into the hiss of the tape, the room was silent for a long moment. Evelyn didn't speak. Tears were streaming freely down her cheeks, but she was smiling. It was a smile of profound relief, of overwhelming pride, of a love so deep it hurt. Her gamble, her savings from the coffee can, had paid the greatest dividend imaginable. "That's it, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "That's the voice I was talking about. That's the boy I knew was in there." Calvin felt his own eyes well up. In that moment, sitting in his aunt's quiet living room, he understood the true meaning of being saved. It wasn't a single event, but 1,000 small acts of faith, culminating in this one cassette tape. He hadn't escaped his reality. He had found a way to master it, to turn its pain and pressure into art. His future was still a long, unwritten road, full of uncertainty and challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time, he was the one holding the pen. The path away from the corner had been opened, not by running, but by creating. He and his aunt sat there together, in the quiet victory of the moment. The music had stopped, but the melody of hope lingered in the air. Outside, the sounds of Long Beach continued their endless rhythm, but inside, a new beat had taken hold. It was the beat of a future, the sound of a legend being born. All thanks to the unwavering faith of the woman who refused to let him go. The rest, as they say, is history. What did you think of Aunt Evelyn's incredible act of faith and the power of believing in someone? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to find your voice. Thank you for watching.